Okay, welcome to APUSH Chapter 4, Part 1, discussion overview here. This is a much more complicated chapter than some of the ones you've read up to this point. Yeah, you can see behind me that we have quite a few long and lengthy essential questions. We'll get to those a little bit later, but I do just want to give you kind of a brief overview of this chapter. It does cover the time period from 1720 to 1765, or right there before the Revolutionary War breaks out. It's a time period that sees a huge number of Germans and Scots-Irish migrating to the United States from Europe. And those migrations, along with the huge numbers of Africans coming over in the slave trade, are really going to change the dynamic of colonial America. The migrations lead to overcrowding in some areas. It leads to religious jostling as these migrants bring their own unique religions with them to America. It's a time period that sees two major schools of thought. The first is the Enlightenment, which was spearheaded by kind of your intellectuals of the time period who thought it was a secular movement, meaning non-religious, and they felt that a person could decide for themselves, that they could be morally right without necessarily the guidance of a minister or anything like that. They believed in self-determination, that it was your job, your ability to determine how you lived your life. The response to that, and it was something called pietism, or, as you should probably know, the Great Awakening. It was a lashing out at this non-religious movement, and they had more numbers. There were more religious people in America at this time than non-religious. They believed that their members should seek the divine grace of God. It was quite simple. These two sides conflicted in this time period. Last thing, generation of population growth in America at this time. It's going to show their dynamic growth. It's going to bring some good things, but it's also going to bring a lot of conflict, not only with the settlers there, but with, of course, our Native Americans. Okay, so let's jump into it. You'll notice over here, we've got four main sections here. They're broken down in your book. I know you can't see all of them over on that side, but the first one we're going to discuss is New England's Freehold Society. So we need to talk a little bit about what that is. The Freehold Society was a yeoman farmer society, meaning that the farmers tended to be small landowners. They owned tens of acres, not thousands of acres, like in the case of the planters of the Chesapeake region. Most people were relatively equal. Farm sizes tended to be roughly the same size. Wealth was roughly the same. But by 1750, all the best parcels of land had already been taken up. So when the new settlers are coming in, they're going to be forced into smaller areas of land, and you're going to see a little slip in social equality. Social equality was also definitely not extended to women. Remember that New England society is still really dominated by those Puritan ideals. It's very strict adherence to the Bible, and in the Bible, God put man above woman. And so that's still the belief that they believe in at this time. There was without a doubt a double standard on sexual issues. If a woman was found outside of marriage, the punishment was severe, whereas men tended to get off the hook. You know this old story. It's still the same today. Guy that has lots of ladies is a player. A lady who has lots of guys is something else. So keep that in mind. Women's primary role in New England was to bear children, to have as many children as possible, and to rear them, which means to raise them. They had large families, typically 7 to 8 children apiece. That will go down as the population increases because there's less land to pass on to these children. So naturally you're going to see a little bit of birth control, women choosing not to have children. They did have birth control methods in that time period. Families tended to, this was not an area or a time period of passing money back and forth. They tended to barter. If one family had excess butter or milk or something, they would trade that to a farmer down the road for a good that they didn't have. In every couple of years, they would settle any excess debt with a little bit of cash, but for the most part, you saw bartering in this time period. It was a father's duty to give his children inheritance, and if he did not, he lost social status in his community. He's the dad that can't provide for his kids. Also, by not being able to pass anything down to the children, it meant that fathers lost their stranglehold on their children, their leverage. You're going to marry this person, you're going to marry that person, you're going to be home when I tell you to be home, you're going to do what I want you to do, or you're going to get your inheritance. Well, when the idea of, well, I'm not getting inheritance anyway, these children are a lot less likely to do everything that their parents say. Okay, so that's the freeholding system in New England, relatively equal, mostly yeoman farmers, still fairly religiously the same. Okay. Now we'll move to the next part, and that is the middle colonies, which are quite a bit different from the New England colonies. They were home to many different peoples, whereas New England colonies tended to be mostly English with a little bit of Dutch mixed in there. In the middle colonies, you had a large influx of Germans to mix with the English, and you had Scots-Irish migrating there as well. Very fertile land, there was a lot of it there. The Quakers, if you remember, controlled this area from the get-go, so that was a good society to be able to migrate to. The rules weren't harsh. There was religious freedom. There were a lot of reasons to want to migrate to the middle colonies. New York colony itself, there were a couple of huge, powerful, wealthy families there that were trying to establish what was going on back in Europe. They wanted to be landlords. They wanted to rent out land to settlers. Well, settlers coming in didn't want that. They didn't own land back in England. That's one of the reasons they left. They're coming to the New World to hopefully buy land for themselves. So a lot of settlers avoided the Hudson River Valley where these landlords set up. And so the landlords had to promise longer leases. If you improved on the land, if you built barns and stuff, you could sell it to the next person who bought your land. These tenants would hope down the line that they could buy their own land, but it was very seldom that actually happened. So settlement in the New York area in the beginning was pretty slow. Now down a little bit south of New York in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, areas dominated by the Quakers, you saw a lot more equity, at least in the beginning. Remember, that's a belief of the Quakers, pacifism, equity. Women had more rights. They were bigger in the church. Religious freedom, all those things that we talked about in the last chapter. But as time went on, and there was this expansion of the wheat trade in the middle colonies, you started to see social distinctions really for the first time. Earlier on, everybody was pretty much equal, but now people started, the families that had been there for a couple of generations were generating wealth. And a lot of your influx of new settlers were poor migrants, so they came in, and you started seeing these social divisions shaping up in the middle colonies. Only about half of the people in the middle colonies actually own land. Now this is way better than it was in England. Very, very, very few people actually own land in England. So, this is still an improvement for most people coming to the colonies and trying to set up a better life. You had a lot of landless sons wandering around because dad couldn't provide them with an inheritance, so they're kind of searching out, seeing what they can do. Merchants would snatch these people up, so it gave them a really cheap labor source. So merchants made pretty good money, so there's social distinction there. This is also not a melting pot. Even though there were Germans and English, Scots and Irish, they did not all blend together like we think of America today. Germans tended to stay in German towns, Scots in Scottish towns, and Germans even saw it as their duty to only marry other German women. They kept the same religions that they came over with, they kept the same cultural aspects that they came over with. There wasn't very much mixing early on in the middle colonies. Again, still early on dominated by the Quakers, who condemned slavery. They would actually boot out members of their society if they owned slaves. But all that by the 1740s is going to disappear because the Quakers actually become outnumbered. And once they become outnumbered, then their principles start to carry less and less weight. And you kind of see their society kind of devolve a little bit. So relations between Indians and the middle colonies is going to get much rougher. Whereas Quakers got along with the Indians, the colonists who settle later on are going to fight with the Indians, of course, over land.